Welcome back, everyone, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of ancient Mediterranean society. So in the last video I set out, I talked a little bit about what we call periodization, how you divide history into periods. And I explained that we have this period of late antiquity that kind of helps us transition from ancient history to medieval history. And I explained that medieval history, fully understood, is made up of these three civilizations: the Byzantine Empire, medieval Europe, and the Islamic civilization in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and the way these three civilizations are interacting with one another. And so we haven't got to that period yet. There's going to be a transition period. We call that transition period late antiquity. Period of late antiquity is the result of developments in the ancient Mediterranean. And so now this is going to be a little bit of a refresher for those of you that took ancient Greece and Rome. Now we're going to look at what this society was like. So basically I'm going to set the context for you for the ancient world. What was the ancient world like right before we start to enter this transition to late antiquity, which itself is a transition towards the fully medieval period. Okay, I hope that clarifies the last video. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this society was like. So, politically speaking, to the east we have the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire. And so that's in this region here. Here it's marked as the Parthian Empire. Now the Parthian Empire came before the Sassanid Empire. So there's always kind of a Persian Empire that's a rival first to the Greeks, and most famously, and then also to the Romans. The Sassanids are a new Persian dynasty that emerge around 150 or so. Around 150 or so, we have this new Sassanid dynasty that starts to emerge. And it is much more aggressive than the previous Parthian dynasty. And so you have this new, aggressive, energetic Persian dynasty that is starting to lay claim to the ancient lands of the Persian Empire. Now, those of you who have taken Western Civ 1 or ancient Greece and Rome will remember that the ancient Persian Empire wasn't over here at all, but that it was in the heart of the Middle East and in Mesopotamia. And so part of the context in which the late antique world develops is that the Roman Empire is facing renewed pressure from a new energetic Persian Empire that is seeking to restore the boundaries of the ancient Persian Empire of Darius and Xerxes and the Persian Wars with the Greeks. Also to the north we have the Gothic tribes. Now, the Gothic tribes are also becoming more of a threat to the Roman Empire than previously. And this is the result of a shift that's taken place in part because of their interactions with the Romans. And again, this is a little bit of review. Much of the material this week will be a review of ancient history classes and Western Civ 1, just to prepare us for our study of the Middle Ages. If we go far enough back, Gothic tribes don't actually exist as tribes. They just exist as extended family units. And they would come across the river Danube that you can see here, and they would raid in Roman territories, and then they would go back across the Danube again. But it wasn't just fighting. We find that there's trade between the Romans and the Germanic tribes. And it shows you here, this map, which I think is really great. It shows you tin, gold, slaves, cattle. These important aspects of Roman life were traded into the Roman Empire. So we know that the Romans and the Germanic tribes, or the Gothic tribes, Germanic tribes, it's the same thing. We know that these groups are interacting with one another. And we know that the Romans would cross the river Danube in order to negotiate with the Germanic tribes. But the Romans didn't want to go over there and just negotiate with the Smith family or the Jackson family. They wanted to go over there and know that they were negotiating, let's say, a trade deal for tin, or they were negotiating a peace settlement. You're not going to come over and raid for another few months. They wanted to know that this was going to be a substantial agreement. And so we find them going to these villages and saying, who's in charge here? Who's in charge of your tribes? Initially, the Goths don't have tribal leaders, but maybe they'd say, okay, the nearest family or a couple of families down, they have more warriors than we do. If they threaten us, we kind of do what they say. And the Romans say, okay, we'll negotiate with them. And so the Romans negotiate with these slightly larger family groups, and that makes these slightly larger family groups more important. And it means that the smaller family groups start to integrate more with the larger family groups and to be obedient to them. And so now what the Romans are actually creating is larger and more powerful groups of Goths than previously. And so when the Goths do raid into the Roman Empire, these raids are much more serious than they would have been previously. So we have a newer, more aggressive Persian Empire. We have new, more powerful, larger groups of Goths, but the Roman Empire still dominates the Mediterranean. How is the Roman Empire governed? It is ruled by an emperor. What is the role of the emperor? The role of the emperor is to unite the army and the Senate. So if we go back into the history of Rome, we know that Rome was initially governed as a republic. Once Rome expands its territories and starts to rule most of the Mediterranean, the institutions of the republic are no longer effective in governing all this territory, all this huge population effectively. And the institutions of the republic, the government of the republic, can no longer control the army. And so it's from this crisis that we find the office of Roman emperor emerging. We'll find this first with Julius Caesar, then Octavian Augustus, and their successors. And so the emperor isn't a sort of Star Wars despot, tyrant at this point. The emperor is considered the leading citizen. He's considered to be the most virtuous citizen. He's someone who both commands the respect of the army and can work with the Senate, the government. And so the emperors unite these two branches of Roman power. They mean that the army doesn't just run roughshod over the Senate. They mean that the Senate listens to the army. And the Roman Empire is divided into provinces. Provinces that today are modern European countries. And so you have about 25 provinces throughout this empire, all of which pay tax to Rome. Remember that we're setting out the economic foundations of medieval Europe at this time. We're talking about ancient society. In this society, the way the foundations of the economy of this society were that the different provinces paid taxes to the Romans. Okay, now let's talk about the economy a little bit more. Roman Empire is very stable and very successful. It exists ruling these regions here, or had done by around 150 AD. It had ruled these regions for about between 1 and 2 centuries. And it had provided great peace. This peace meant that people, merchants, businessmen, and businesswomen were willing to conduct, or were able to conduct, trade across this vast region. And so that meant, for example, that trade could travel across the Mediterranean, as you see with the orange lines across the Mediterranean here. And generally speaking, the further you're moving your goods, you're moving them to a region that has less of those goods, and the price you're going to receive is going to be higher. For example, if you're moving copper, if you're only moving it to the next town over, say, well, we have copper too. You probably have a little bit more than us, so we're going to pay you to bring your excess copper here. If you're moving copper all the way over to, Spain has copper. If you're moving copper all the way over to Western France, they say, well, we don't have any copper at all. We're really desperate for copper. So we're going to pay you large amounts of money. And so this is the foundations of the Roman economy. Different provinces pay taxes to Rome, which is governed by the Senate and the emperor. And these taxes are some kind of payment that's taken from Roman trade. And because the Roman Empire provides a peaceful sphere of influence, you have a high volume of trade, and trade is very profitable. Not just local trade, but regional trade, and even, so by regional trade, I mean trade across the Mediterranean, even trade that is intercontinental, long-distance trade that connects Rome with Egypt, and from Egypt to India, to Vietnam, and to China. We have records of Roman coins in Vietnam. We have both Chinese and Roman records of trade with China. So Roman stability makes this trade possible. This trade produces money, which in turn is taxed. These taxes are used to maintain the peace and stability that Rome provides. They're used to maintain roads so that these goods can be transported locally. They're used to maintain and pay the Roman army so that you maintain this sphere of peace and stability in which trade can take place. This kind of trade supports major cities and infrastructure. If you have this amount of wealth that's changing hands, and you have this kind of stability, it means that more people can rely on food being brought into the cities. Not everyone has to work for their own food. People can live in cities. People can conduct more and more specialized trade. And so we have bigger and bigger cities, and the taxes that come from the trade are used to support the cities, to build secure walls, to build aqueducts so that water is supplied to the cities, to build roads connecting the cities with other points of importance in the empire. Stability also produces a culture of education. Just as people can live in cities and can specialize the businesses they're pursuing, similarly, people aren't having to worry about producing their own food. They're able to focus on learning. And so within these Roman cities, we do have a culture of education, culture of learning, has its origins in Greek education. So we find that subjects like grammar and rhetoric, subjects like law, subjects like history, philosophy, that these are becoming an expected part of the upbringing of the wealthier, younger Roman men and women. Lastly, we have Roman religion. Traditional pagan rituals, sacrifices to the pagan gods, they are part of the public life of this society. In the same way that we have 4th of July fireworks, you have sacrifices to Jupiter. That may sound counterintuitive to us, but that is how this society was constructed. And so you have traditional sacrifice to the gods. It's also understood that you should sacrifice to your ancestors. Your ancestors can perhaps help you if they were good and virtuous people, or they can perhaps curse you and haunt you if you displease them. And so you have these traditional religions that are just kind of a staple of Roman life. But you also have a growing interest in private religious cults. And so, as well as participating in these public rituals, we also see people choosing private religious cults that are a little bit idiosyncratic, that fit with their own particular interests. 2 of these cults, particularly want to keep in mind, are Judaism and Christianity. And I've provided a map here that shows you the spread of Christianity. And you can see that the time that we're talking about, beginning, Christianity is pretty isolated. but it's also starting to spread. That adds a new dynamic to this society.